Welcome back to the channel, everybody. Today is Sunday, October 25th. We are 9 days away now from the senatorial elections on November the 3rd, as well as the gubernatorial elections, the presidential election, and basically everything you can think of all the way down to dog catcher is up for election on November the 3rd. This is going to be our 9-day Senate election prediction video. Again, remember, all the way through to day zero, we're coming out with a presidential and senatorial election update every single day. So let's get right into it. In the state of Alaska, Dan Sullivan here in the 11th hour is still hanging on against Al Gross. Al Gross has kept it close enough to where this is not going to be something that's called right away. In fact, I would imagine this is a race that may not get decided until Wednesday morning, November 4th. Obviously, because of the time difference, because we go east to west with this whole deal. But because it's also not going to be a state that we can just call right away at the snap of a finger. It's also going to take a few hours to do some counting and to see if Dr. Al Gross indeed actually has a chance. Some of the powers that be, a lot of the Republican big congressional delegations and all that stuff, and the fundraising groups, they have poured a lot of money into this state out of fears of having just a big tidal wave of Democratic senators winning. If they can sort of hang on to a state like Alaska, then that'll sort of help ease that burden a little bit. But as of right now, I think Dan Sullivan, this is more of a likelihood characterization as opposed to a margin. I'm going to label it likely. Jeff Merkley's going to be fine, as we know in Oregon, as will Jim Risch in Idaho. Now, Mark Kelly is firmly in the driver's seat at this point. There are only 9 days left. Martha McSally, she's basically on her last legs. I think most of us would be absolutely shell-shocked if she pulled this out. There's just been nothing really throughout the entire campaign season, to be entirely honest, that would suggest that Martha McSally is really in any kind of position to win this race. It could be a little closer than people think, because I think they're on, from a national perspective, there may have been a little bit of complacency here. Mark Kelly has not raised as much money as some of the candidates over on the East Coast or Teresa Greenfield in Iowa. But that may be just because I think most people correctly have not assumed, but are expecting Mark Kelly to defeat Martha McSally without too big an issue. McSally is the incumbent, but as we know, she was defeated 2 years ago, and there's not much of a reason to really believe that she would suddenly win this time around against a candidate that is touching Arizona voters very, very effectively. Gun control has been an issue in this state that voters are very passionate about for a long time. And of course, no one can speak to that better than Mark Kelly, whose wife, of course, was a victim of gun violence, that being former Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords. So that obviously hits close to home for them. The other fact of the matter is it's just close enough of a state now as well, where Donald Trump won with only a plurality 4 years ago, and Kyrsten Sinema defeated, guess who, Martha McSally, in the midterms 2 years ago. So I'm going to label this likely for Mark Kelly and the Democrats, and that is one of the net 3 seats that they need on the night. Now in Montana, another very fascinating state. Steve Bullock is doing everything he can right now to get this seat flipped for the Democrats. So I'll say this, he's basically the only Democrat that could win a Senate seat in this state. It's very, very hard for a Democrat to win consecutive, let's put it that way, statewide races, even if in terms of like one candidate will win one race and then the other will win another. What do I mean by that? Well, this is a state that has a long history of electing Democrats. Max Baucus, Jon Tester, and of course, as we know, there has not been a Republican governor of the state of Montana since 2000. Okay, think about it. That's a long time for a ruby red state. Steve Bullock, of course, continued that streak when in 2016 he won re-election for another term as governor on the same night that Donald Trump won the state by over 20 points. So clearly, Bullock is a very well-liked figure in this state. And as a result, I think he absolutely has a real shot at defeating Steve Daines. But the problem for Bullock has been he just hasn't really been able to break through against Daines. Bullock led right away when he announced his candidacy, but since then, Daines has taken the upper hand and kept it in his column, complicating this race for Steve Bullock. The Democrats look like they have a little bit of the upper hand. It's basically the same race in reverse in the House. It's a very close race, but the Democrat, Kathleen Williams, is currently leading Matt Rosendale. Matt Rosendale ran against Jon Tester unsuccessfully 2 years ago for the Senate. And meanwhile, there's a very competitive gubernatorial race going on there as well. Right now, it looks like the Republicans might finally get this governorship back in their column Greg Gianforte narrowly leads the Lieutenant Governor, Mike Cooney. So maybe there's a little bit of a referendum going on here because, both Steve Bullock and Mike Cooney are part of the same administration, obviously, and they both very narrowly and very closely are losing their races. So we'll see ultimately if that pans out that way. I still expect Steve Bullock to get around 48, maybe 49%, and I wouldn't be hardly surprised at all if he ends up winning this race, but right now Steve Daines has the upper hand. We're not even going to discuss Wyoming. Now, John Hickenlooper, I think, has basically already won this race in Colorado. You can never be completely sure, and as we've said many times on this channel, we do not label non-incumbent candidates ever safe because they still have that burden. They are the ones that have to flip the seat, and that's never an easy thing to do. But if there ever was one, it's kind of this one in Colorado. John Hickenlooper, kind of similarly to Montana, is the most popular politician in this state. The former governor, they're kind of a moderate Democrat. That was his pitch when he briefly ran for president before switching gears, dropping out, and deciding to run for Senate against Cory Gardner. Cory Gardner is not a very popular senator, votes with Donald Trump over 90% of the time. He was elected in that big Republican wave year back in 2014. And so basically against any Democratic candidate, he was going to be a little vulnerable, but against John Hickenlooper, it's a little bit of a mismatch. The polling has been very consistent in favor of John Hickenlooper, as has the fundraising, so I expect this to go John Hickenlooper's way. Ben Ray Lujan is going to take this open seat for the Democrats. That's a nice retention for them as well, because it kind of helps solidify the fact that this state has really come into its own for them over the last several years. Now, South Dakota, there's obviously not really a serious race here. It's always an interesting state to watch, sometimes because the Democrats can really get something done from time to time here, but you never exactly know. Whereas Nebraska, Ben Sasse, it's not even really anything to talk about. Now, in Kansas, Roger Marshall, this is a little bit of a nuisance for the GOP. Because ideally they could really be throwing the kitchen sink back at the Democrats in these two southwestern states, helping themselves in North Carolina, Maine, Iowa, kind of putting Alaska to bed as well. But, suddenly a real race has popped up here in Kansas because we saw in 2018 that the Kansas voters are not afraid to elect Democrats, just as they did with Laura Kelly in 2018 when she defeated Chris Kobach in kind of a stunning gubernatorial flip from red to blue. Now those same voters rejected Chris Kobach in the Senate primary and nominated one of the representatives from the state, that being Roger Marshall. So he is now being challenged. It's a good candidate for the Democrats at the same time, and it's Barbara Bollier, a current state senator, a former Republican. So they fielded a pretty good candidate as well here. She's pretty electable for a state like Kansas, obviously quite a moderate as well. Polling has been consistent for Marshall, though, not by very much, by less than 6 points. Some within the margin of error. We saw one or two outliers, I think, that had Bollier up by 1-2 points. So it's definitely not going to be a state that we call right away on election night. I think it's a state that I'd say Barbara Bollier has like maybe a 15-20% chance of winning this state. It would definitely be surprising, but it's not, South Dakota or Idaho. It's actually a race that we do need to watch. So more from a likelihood characterization, I'm going to label it likely. Jim Inhofe has nothing to worry about in Oklahoma. Now in Texas, we just, we just kind of had an earth-shattering moment in our presidential election prediction video when we characterized the state of Texas as tilt Democrat for the first time. That coming out on the heels of a University of Texas at Tyler and Dallas Morning News poll released today that had Joe Biden leading Donald Trump by 3%. That was sort of the tilting poll for me. That's kind of what finally pushed it over the edge for me. Whereas John Cornyn is thoroughly still ahead of MJ Hager. Now, Hager has ate into that lead ever so slightly, but it's just not enough. Now, I do think Hager is going to get around 45%, 46% of the vote, which is a good result. Not as much because of her candidacy and more just because this is a changing state. There are a lot of Democrats in Texas, and the Republican Party has suffered some in this state. And also, what does it tell you? That you have a lot of voters of John Cornyn's that are suddenly turning on Donald Trump. So more of a likelihood characterization, this is going to be likely. Now, Tina Smith is the one up here in Minnesota. If it was Amy Klobuchar, we wouldn't even talk about this. But Tina Smith, I think this is just competitive enough to where we need to discuss it, and it's not going to be safe because I think that Tina Smith, some of the recent polling has been a little worrisome for the Democrats. We've seen her up by 5 points, 6 points. That's a little too close, I think, for them. Now, how often do you really see a candidate who's down by 5-6% on average with less than 2 weeks left actually win? You hardly ever see that. And everything that we saw, of course, in the 2018 midterms when Tina Smith won, when she was far more vulnerable, because remember, she was the one who was replacing the resigned Senator Al Franken in a special election. So if there was ever a time for the Republicans to flip a Senate seat in Minnesota, it would be then, and they didn't. That same night that she won that special election, Amy Klobuchar also easily won, and Tim Walz, the governor, won re-election as well. So you had a clean sweep there for the Democrats in the statewide races. Everything that happened in Minneapolis with the whole George Floyd situation, that's only going to help to boost Democratic turnout. So I'm going to label it likely. Okay, now in Iowa, Teresa Greenfield is just barely in front of Joni Ernst. This is one of the closest Senate races I think I've ever seen. This is going to be an absolute nail biter. I cannot wait to see how this race unfolds. Joni Ernst is, this is a coin flip. And I think Teresa Greenfield right now has the smallest of edges from a polling perspective. She has a lead of less than 1%. But she just ever so slightly has the edge because of fundraising, even though some of that has tailed off in recent weeks. We've learned that they have had to incur some budget cuts, the Greenfield campaign, although it's a little late in the game for that to be too effective. Meanwhile, this is a state that has been a little friendlier to the Democrats, as most of these have been since 2016. The gubernatorial race narrowed up considerably by about 6% from the presidential race in 2016. And of the 4 House seats in this state, 3 of them, as we know, are controlled by Democrats. And the 4th one is one they're never going to control, because that was the one up here in the northwest portion of the state that was run by Steve King for ages. So right now, Greenfield has a very small lead. Joni Ernst did not help herself in the last debate between these two, when the 2 candidates were asked about the trading price of a bushel of corn, only in Iowa. And so Teresa Greenfield was swiftly able to give a correct response, and Joni Ernst was helpless and did not know the answer. And she was even given a second attempt by the moderator, and she declined it. So it was a little painful to watch. But we'll see if the undecideds in Dubuque and Des Moines and wherever else heed that, and we'll see if they ultimately side with Teresa Greenfield. I think just because of a very small lead in polling, Iowa's often a state where polling is very accurate. I'm going to label Iowa just barely tilt for the Democrats and Teresa Greenfield. Tom Cotton's going to be fine in Arkansas, just as Bill Cassidy will in Louisiana. Now, Cindy Hyde-Smith, I think we can all expect that she is probably going to be able to survive this race against Mike Espy. It would take a tidal wave of voters turnout in this state. And look, we already expect very high turnout in Mississippi in this election, and even then, Mike Espy is not expected to win this race. I'm a little surprised that he even threw his hat in the ring, to be entirely honest, because he didn't win in that special election, and that was when Cindy Hyde-Smith her electability was at an all-time low. She had got into some hot water with some racially tone-deaf or racially charged comments. And Mike Espy was a minority running in a high minority population state. We get the whole deal. I still expect him to get around 44-45% of the vote here. Won't be called right away. So I'm going to label this likely, more from a likelihood characterization. Doug Jones is toast in Alabama. Okay, I think we all know that. There was sort of a last gasp, thing that we saw the other day where Jones actually led in a poll by 1% over Tommy Tuberville. The Democratic big fundraising arms have not really invested much in this race. The writing is on the wall. Tommy Tuberville is going to be able to upset Doug Jones. But again, incumbency advantage gives this only a likely. Now, in Georgia, we have 2 very competitive races here. David Perdue is in a tough race against Jon Ossoff. This is another kind of nuisance here for the Republicans. They didn't expect, I think they knew this would be a competitive race, but maybe not quite this competitive. Ossoff has been within 1 to 2 points basically throughout this entire election season. We have seen some polls here and there that have we have seen some here and there that have David Perdue leading by a little bit bigger margin, 5, 6, sometimes even 7, 8 points. But we've also seen some polls that have Ossoff leading by 1, 2 points. So obviously that gives Perdue the edge, although the other day he didn't help himself when he made a little bit of a racist intentional mispronunciation of the potential vice president, that being Kamala Harris. You can go see for yourself. It was pretty tone deaf at best, and definitely incendiary at worst. So that definitely didn't help him, and voters responded because within 24 hours, Jon Ossoff had raised over $2 million after that. Now, did that all come from Georgia voters? Not necessarily. It could have come from anywhere. But it definitely matters. Okay, so I still have this tilt because I just don't think we've seen the data to back up the fact that Purdue is going to lose this race. But I think Jon Ossoff will get around 48%, kind of usually where Democrats peter out in this race in Georgia. Now, the special election is fascinating because for a long time, this looked like this was kind of a race not even worth discussing. Kelly Loeffler and Doug Collins, it appeared as though those two would just be the top two vote getters and they would both move on to a runoff, making it a basically pointless election to even watch. But the point is now Raphael Warnock has surged into the lead. He's the first place vote getter in most of these polls, and a lot of that had to do with Barack Obama's endorsement. So he has sort of consolidated his Democratic colleagues' support. He does get first place voter share, although the problem is, as we know in runoffs, the second place finisher often wins because a much larger share of the vote goes to the other member of his party, and then he consolidates that in the runoff and he wins. Now, what we don't know yet is whether or not we're going to see the same kind of energy, though, for Raphael Warnock as well. The point is, we have seen some individual polls where Warnock has led both Republican candidates in a one-on-one hypothetical matchup, which is definitely is very encouraging for the Warnock campaign. Another problem that they might run into is, assuming he doesn't get 50%, and it's pretty likely that he won't, we go to a runoff in January. You can probably imagine that energy and turnout is going to be lower by then. This election will have been over. One of the most important elections of all time will be over, where turnout is ridiculously high. You get the whole thing. So I think people are going to be a little burned out by it. Now, if the control of the Senate literally hinges on this race, then maybe it'll still be pretty high. But for those reasons, I'm still going to label this tilt Republican. All right, now Jamie Harrison is this has become a pretty amazing development here. Jamie Harrison has a chance to win this race. Okay, he really does. I think for a while this was seen as a race where it's, the Democrat, it's a great story. Jamie Harrison's kind of a rising star. Maybe he gets a cabinet position in a new Democratic administration. He's a bright spot in what could otherwise be a tough election sometimes. That's not the case now. Okay, Jamie Harrison can actually win this race. Let's go through the polling. Okay, not only is he the best fundraising candidate in United States Senate history, with an absolutely ridiculous fundraising haul in the third quarter, $58 million. The most recent poll was from Morning Consult, had him by 2 points. Okay, a poll 6 days before that by a group called Brilliant Corners Research and Strategies had Harrison by 2 points. Now, a New York Times poll from the 15th did have Lindsey Graham by 6 points, but that was only out of 600 voters. The one just before that, out of a larger sample size, had Harrison up by a point, and the one before that had him tied. And the one before that had Harrison leading. Okay, so you would say over the last, 3-4 weeks, Jamie Harrison is actually somewhat the favorite. I think if this race had gone on like another month, Harrison would kind of firmly take the lead here. This race has narrowed up and narrowed up and narrowed up. I would give Jamie Harrison about a 25, maybe 30% chance of winning this Senate seat. He has so much money that he's using. They're just flooding the South Carolina airwaves with negative ads against Lindsey Graham. The Lincoln Project has been involved in this race. Lindsey Graham, this is going to be by far the toughest race of Lindsey Graham's career. I would be a little surprised if Jamie Harrison pulled this out, but it's not impossible. I would say it's a little bit more likely that Jamie Harrison wins this race than... I'd say it's more likely Jamie Harrison defeats Lindsey Graham than MJ Hager defeats John Cornyn. In fact, I would even give, I think you can basically characterize this like more or less the same way about the Michigan race, although we'll get to that a little bit later. So right now, I'm going to label this tilt for the Republicans. Bill Hagerty, he'll be fine in Tennessee. Now, Cal Cunningham, this is, a little concerning for the Democrats. This notion that he has been totally unscathed by this sexting scandal, that's not really correct, okay? I mean, he has been a little, harmed by that scandal. His lead has shrunk. I think it came out at the right time for him. His lead was big enough. People had already voted in a lot of cases. But yeah, I mean, Tom Tillis has shrunk that lead some. Now, there was a poll just today that had him up by 6%, which is definitely a sigh of relief for him. I think Tom Tillis's positive COVID-19 test obviously didn't help him. It kind of compromised his ability to do some last-minute campaigning. But there is no question whatsoever that Tom Tillis is among the most vulnerable Republican incumbents. At this point, I would be a little surprised if Tillis won this seat. I think that we're seeing so much enthusiasm here. This is definitely helping Joe Biden as well. Cunningham has been another candidate that's raised ridiculous sums of money. Joe Biden and Cal Cunningham are both being boosted by the fact that Roy Cooper is up for re-election this time, an extremely popular incumbent Democratic governor and a possible Senate candidate in 2022 against Richard Burr, who of course is still facing allegations of insider trading. So at the moment, I still have this as a tilt for the Democrats. Dick Durbin, he's going to be fine in Illinois. McConnell will be fine against Amy McGrath. Shelley Moore Capito in West Virginia. Mark Warren will be fine in Virginia. These will all be called right at closing hour. Maybe the Kentucky race, you might get like half an hour of serious counting, just because Amy McGrath is a serious candidate, but it's not really a serious race. All right, so I mentioned the Michigan race a minute ago. John James is giving this another shot, kind of similar to Mike Espy, only this time he's running against Gary Peters. 2 years ago, he ran unsuccessfully against Debbie Stabenow by about 5.7% was what Stabenow was able to win by. Now, the Democrats have been sounding the alarm a little bit on this race. I think that's a little overblown. Now, are they wrong to do that? No, because they just don't want to be complacent. But there have been a lot of people who have talked about this race Gary Peters being really vulnerable. I don't. The reality of the situation is John James's chance to win was 2 years ago, and that was when he was a fresh new candidate, and the Republicans that night had a very, very good night in the Senate. They managed to outraise the Democrats in a lot of Senate races. They just have not been able to do that this time. This is a far bigger Democratic wave here than it even was 2 years ago, when the Democrats, mind you, even though they lost 2 Senate seats, a net 2 Senate seats, flipped 7 governorships and 40 House seats. Okay? So this is an even bigger Democratic wave here than that. And I just can't see John James, especially when he's down in the polls regularly, has never led Gary Peters, even in those Trafalgar Group polls, which are very right-leaning and are like a C- graded pollster. Even those have Gary Peters prevailing over John James. So I still label this as a lean Democrat, more as a margin characterization. The VP nod, as we know, that Kamala Harris and the Democrats still have that nod. You look at it here, the Republicans only need 1 more seat, but Delaware, Chris Coons is going to get that seat for the Democrats. Cory Booker will win one in New Jersey. Jack Reed will take a Senate seat in Rhode Island, as will Ed Markey in Massachusetts to even it up at 49. Jeanne Shaheen, an incumbent Democrat here in New Hampshire. We've talked about this many times, how if you're the Republicans and you nominate a real serious candidate for this state, you can win in the state of New Hampshire. They just haven't done that. Kelly Ayotte, that's just not the prominent sort of moderate Republican that they were hoping to get. And as a result, Jeanne Shaheen has been way ahead in the polls. There's your 50th seat. And as I said on our last prediction, the time has run out on Susan Collins. Okay, throughout the election season, I kind of defended her against people who were saying she was already done because she's a resilient figure. And I figured, okay, listen, Sarah Gideon has been leading, but not by that much. She's been sometimes, well within the margin of error. She got an endorsement, Susan Collins did, from Joe Lieberman, a Democrat. Angus King is someone who's been very fond of her. Her comrade, her colleague in the Senate from that same state for a long time. So it's very clear, I thought, that Susan Collins still had a real shot to win. But that was provided she eventually overtook Sarah Gideon in the polling, and that just hasn't happened. And now we're only 9 days away, and Sarah Gideon is on track to unseat Susan Collins. I'm going to label it lean as sort of both a margin and likelihood characterization. I apologize for the noise here. It's just pouring once again here in South Florida, as it is one to do in the month of October. So there you have it, 51-49 flips in Arizona, Colorado, Iowa, North Carolina, and Maine, with retentions for the Democrats in New Hampshire, Michigan, and Minnesota. The Republicans hang on in Montana, Georgia, and South Carolina. So let's go through all the winners, as we always do. Dan Sullivan wins in Alaska, Jeff Merkley in Oregon, Jim Risch in Idaho, Mark Kelly in Arizona, Steve Daines in Montana, Mike Enzi in Wyoming, John Hickenlooper in Colorado, Ben Ray Lujan in Mexico. Now going into the Big Red Wall, Mike Rounds and Ben Sass win in South Dakota and Nebraska. Roger Marshall puts a pipe dream to bed against Barbara Bollier. Jim Inhofe wins in Oklahoma, and John Cornyn outlasts MJ Hager. Tina Smith serves her first full 6-year term now in the state of Minnesota. And Teresa Greenfield wins in one of the most competitive Senate races I think I've ever seen against Joni Ernst. Tom Cotton wins against an independent in Arkansas, and Bill Cassidy wins in Louisiana. Cindy Hyde-Smith wins in the rematch against Mike Espy. Tommy Tuberville unseats the Democratic incumbent Doug Jones. In Georgia, Jon Ossoff comes up just short, I think, against David Perdue. And in all likelihood, I imagine this will be Doug Collins defeating Raphael Warnock in the special election in Georgia. Lindsey Graham is going to survive here against Jamie Harrison in South Carolina. Bill Hagerty will win in Tennessee. Cal Cunningham puts his scandals to bed and wins in North Carolina. Dick Durbin, of course, still a part of the Democratic leadership, and I think a dark horse candidate potentially for Senate Majority Leader if Chuck Schumer is voted out. Wins in Illinois. Mitch McConnell wins another 6 years in Kentucky. Shelley Moore Capito in West Virginia, and Mark Warner in Virginia. Gary Peters wins in a pretty competitive and remotely close race against John James, while Chris Coons, Cory Booker, Jack Reed, and Ed Markey all win up here in the New England area. And lastly, Jeanne Shaheen wins in New Hampshire, and Susan Collins goes down to Sarah Gideon, giving the Democrats 51 seats in the outright majority to 49 for the Republicans. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Please comment down the suggestions below. Subscribe if you have not already, and hit the like button. Please comment down any questions, comments, suggestions, concerns, corrections, whatever you may have. And that'll do it for our 9-day Senate election prediction video. So thank you guys again so much for watching, and I'll see you in November.